Okay, so in this EdPuzzle, we're going to be looking at reproductive isolating mechanisms. And these are behaviors, ecological processes, or structures that help prevent interspecies mating and dating. Helps prevent species from mating with each other and producing offspring, which more than likely would not have very good fitness. So we're going to talk about the ways that you can prevent hybrids or offspring of two different species from forming. So as we've been discussing in class, a species, and what we are going with is the biological species concept. So this basically states that a species is defined as being reproductively isolated from other such groups, right? So you have multiple populations, maybe groups of individuals of the same species that are interacting with each other and possibly migrating back and forth between populations. But those individuals can interbreed with each other because they're all the same species. So if a species is reproductively isolated, this means that it cannot mate with another species and form viable, meaning that they live, and fertile, meaning that they can reproduce offspring. So if the offspring are not viable, they don't live, if the offspring cannot reproduce on their own, then generally we would say those two species are reproductively isolated from each other, even though they have had a mating event that has produced a hybrid. So a hybrid is basically just the offspring that result from two species mating with each other. So if we have enough isolating mechanisms in place, hybrids should not form. And even if they do, those hybrids should be not viable and should be infertile if those two species are indeed separate species, right? Because of course this is a bit of a continuum, right? You have species are continuing to evolve over time, and so if the speciation event has been recent, meaning not a lot of time has passed since there was the barrier to gene flow, as we've been talking about in class. If that barrier has formed recently, then the two separate at the moment populations, but maybe are becoming separate species, they may still be similar enough to where they could interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring. But if you have enough mechanisms in place, these reproductive isolating mechanisms, then that will prevent those hybrids from forming, and it will essentially keep those populations of new species separate from each other and allow speciation to continue. So reproductive isolating mechanisms are essentially barriers to gene flow between populations of different species. They basically prevent hybrids from forming in the first place, which are referred to as prezygotic isolating mechanisms, or they affect the viability or fertility of a hybrid if it does form, and those are referred to as postzygotic isolating mechanisms. Okay, so we have two main types of reproductive isolating mechanisms, or what I will often abbreviate as RIMS because it's a whole lot easier than saying reproductive isolating mechanisms a million times. We have two main types, prezygotic and postzygotic. So prezygotic, as the name implies, right, this is before the zygote forms, and a zygote is basically a fertilized egg, right? This is a new organism that's separate from their parents. In the case of interspecific mating, right, a zygote that forms is a hybrid. So basically, a prezygotic isolating mechanism is preventing hybrids from forming in the first place. Prezygotic isolating mechanisms are often among the first to evolve. They're extremely important in the speciation process. And in some cases, they might actually be part of the reason that the populations are separated from each other in the first place. They may be part of that speciation mechanism. And I'll go into the detail more on that here in just a second. So prezygotic isolating mechanisms often involve situations where, for example, individuals just can't get to each other. They can't find each other in the landscape. They're not active at the same period of time. They don't recognize each other as a potential mating partner. There's just a recognition mechanism that is just not there anymore because there have been enough changes in the two populations to where they no longer recognize each other. If mating is attempted, it's not successful, so there may be some morphological changes that have happened in terms of genitalia or recognition on the surface, for example, of an egg to where it does not recognize the sperm of the wrong species. It also could involve situations where the sperm just can't get to the egg, it can't navigate the reproductive tract, or there's some other mechanism that's preventing fertilization from happening. So with a prezygotic isolating mechanism, a zygote doesn't even form. You don't have a hybrid because you prevented mating in the first place. So there are several different types of prezygotic isolating mechanisms. One of them is what's known as habitat isolation. So with this isolating mechanism, the two different species are often present in adjacent geographic areas, or they're present in the same general area, but they're occupying different sort of microhabitats within that general area, such that they don't have an occasion to essentially interact with each other. Habitat isolation is often the result of a process that we've talked about in class when we were talking about mechanisms for gene flow to be disrupted, called habitat differentiation, where you have essentially two subpopulations of a single population form that are using the habitat differently. They might be foraging in different micro habitats, or they might be specializing on different food sources, or any number of different things. They may be starting to be active at different times of the day, something along those lines. And that's leading us to the situation where once speciation has fully occurred, there's no opportunity for hybrids to form because the species are using the habitat in such a way that they just don't interact with each other. So here we've got an example of two different species of garter snake. And they can live right alongside each other. One's terrestrial though, and as you can see from the photograph, the other one is aquatic, meaning it spends most of its time in the water. And so even though their overall geographic range will overlap, they really are foraging for different food items, they're spending their time differently, and they just don't have the opportunity to interact with each other to result in any mating. Another type of isolating mechanism, that's a prezygotic mechanism, is known as temporal isolation. So temporal basically referring to time differences. So this generally means that your two species are active at different times of day. So maybe you have one species is nocturnal and the other is diurnal, or one's again diurnal and the other one is crepuscular, meaning they're active in very early morning and late evening, but not in the middle of the day. So essentially they are maybe in the same geographic area, but they're not active at the same time. So they really have no occasion to sort of bump into each other and have potential mating occur. It also could be that they are reproducing perhaps at different times of the year. So for example, our spotted skunks, we have the western spotted skunk. Yes, we have striped skunks here in California. We also have spotted skunks. They're just not as common, but they're super cute and still, super stinky as well. So spotted skunks in the western spotted skunk mates in the fall and gives birth in the early spring. Eastern spotted skunks mate in the spring and give birth in early summer. Likely reflective of differences in, for example, the harshness of winter conditions, other things like that that have led to them being active at different in different seasons. So in terms of reproduction, so they may be living in the same kind of habitat and sometimes in the same geographic area where their ranges overlap, right? So in the middle of the country where you have both species, they may even bump into each other, but they're not going to mate with each other because if you're a western spotted skunk, you're mating in the fall, and if you're an eastern spotted skunk, you're mating in the spring. And so you just don't have the opportunity to form a hybrid. And so as a behaviorist, here comes my favorite isolation mechanism, behavioral isolation. So these are differences in courtship behavior or courtship rituals, right? So this could be songs, dances, plumage patterns, other coloration patterns, anything that is essentially sexually selected, either intrasexual or intersexual, but sexually selected mechanisms that are different between the two species, and so they prevent members from recognizing each other as potential partners. So again, you may be in a situation where the geographic ranges of the species overlap. In some cases they overlap quite a bit, meaning that they are in the same general geographic area at the same time. They may even be living in the same habitat at the same time, but they don't recognize each other because you have different courtship mechanisms, and that's preventing those hybrids from forming. So, for example, looking at our meadowlarks, which we have, western meadowlarks are going to be quite active. Actually, they're probably done breeding this by summer. They're very active, though, in other parts of their distribution. So east of here, where perhaps it's late spring, if you're up in the mountains, for example, you're going to be hearing western meadowlarks singing. For my money, looking at the plumage patterns between the two, they look extremely similar, right? You've got the bright yellow chest and yellow patches on the head, and then you've got this sort of black V in the front. And so for my money, they look really, really similar as well. However, females are not fooled because they are listening for the song of their people, and it's quite different. So a western meadowlark sounds something like this. Boop, 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 beep, boop, boop. Where a eastern meadowlark, so we have boop, 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 beep, boop, 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 as compared to a eastern meadowlark that sounds like this. Beep, boop, boop, boop. Quite different. And especially their females are going to be very well tuned to the song that their male sings. They're paying very close attention because they're getting a lot of information about the quality of that male from his song, and of course they're not going to be fooled by the other species. So they can both be singing in the same place at the same time, and the females are not going to get confused. So another kind of isolating mechanism involves what's referred to as mechanical isolation. So these are the kinds of isolating mechanisms that have evolved to prevent the physical act of mating. So basically, the genitalia don't fit, or the organisms are such different sizes and shapes to where even if they do recognize each other as potential mating partners, they actually can't complete the reproductive event, right? So basically you have an interruption or a failure of mating to occur because there's some physical problem, right? So for example, here we've got some line drawings of damselfly genitalia. And these different species have very different shaped genitalia, as you can see. And we think this, actually, a lot of this has resulted, has evolved as a result of genetic drift. So random changes that have built up over time in the two different species, because again, there's no gene flow. They're not mixing their gene pools together. So any random changes that occur in one species are not going to be reflected in the other, and therefore you get these differences that are produced over time. A good number of our prezygotic isolating mechanisms do take some time to evolve. So quite often you will have another prezygotic mechanism like habitat isolation or behavioral isolation that evolves first, and then mechanical isolation or other kinds of similar mechanisms will evolve later on. And finally, the last kind of prezygotic isolating mechanism is known as gametic isolation. So in this case, mating has occurred if fertilization is internal, but there is a problem with the sperm not being able to reach the egg because it can't survive in the female's reproductive tract. Mainly, we see gametic isolation in species that are free spawners. They basically release their gametes into the surrounding environment, and they, combine randomly with each other. And so, of course, to prevent hybrids from forming and to prevent interspecies mating, there are recognition proteins on the surface of the egg, and so therefore it will not bind with or allow to enter sperm of the wrong species. The recognition mechanism just isn't there. This is a complex system involving different kinds of recognition proteins. And so if that essentially recognition handshake doesn't happen on the surface of the egg with the sperm cell, then fertilization does not occur. So gametic isolation is sort of your, I don't want to say well, it is pretty much your last last step right before fertilization occurs. Okay, so far we've been talking about isolating mechanisms that prevent fertilization from occurring, and therefore they prevent hybrids from forming in the first place. Now these mechanisms are not foolproof. You sometimes have situations where either you don't have sufficient prezygotic mechanisms in place, they haven't evolved yet, or again, organisms have made a mistake or somehow have come into contact with each other and have successfully mated, and you've had a hybrid form. If those two species are truly reproductively isolated from each other, though, this means that the hybrid that does form should be either not viable, meaning it doesn't survive, or not fertile, meaning it can't reproduce on its own, or possibly both, both of those things. And that would, again, would prevent additional hybrids from forming through negative feedback on the individuals that essentially made a mistake in mating with the wrong species. So those individuals essentially would have reduced fitness because the organisms that they produced through mating did not live and or were not able to reproduce on their own. We also have to remember that hybrids are the product of two different species mating with each other. Hybrids are not their own species. It's a hybrid. It's a mix of two different species. So on their own, hybrids generally are not able to, in most cases, mate with other hybrids and continue right to the next generation and the next generation and so on. And I will revisit that more here in a minute. So if there essentially there is an insufficient prezygotic isolating mechanisms, or there's been an error or mistake somehow whereby you've actually been able to accomplish interspecies mating and a hybrid has formed, we have three main types of postzygotic isolating mechanisms that do, in most cases, tend to keep the two species apart and help reinforce their separate evolutionary trajectories. So one is reduced hybrid viability. So this is essentially the idea that if a hybrid does form, it doesn't survive long enough to be able to complete its development and long enough to maybe be able to mate on its own. So for example, we have a zone in basically Northern California, right over the Oregon border, where the ranges of leopard frogs and wood frogs overlap. And as you can see from the pictures, they look quite similar. There are some differences in their visual appearance, but they're living in essentially the same kinds of habitat. And so they do have occasion to bump into each other periodically. And almost every year you get a small handful of hybrids that form, but those hybrids don't survive more than a few days. So this basically helps remind us that yes, they are indeed two separate species because their offspring are not viable, right? And they're not fertile either, presumably, although we don't get to find that out because they don't live long enough to test that question. What this also means, of course, is the individuals who make a mistake and mate with the wrong species are not passing on their genes, right? So their genotypes and corresponding phenotypes are being eliminated from the gene pool. And over time, what we should see is fewer hybrids forming over time because individuals who are making mistakes are being eliminated from the population. So another postzygotic isolating mechanism that helps keep species apart, helps prevent additional hybrids from forming, is reduced hybrid fertility. So as the name implies, this basically means the hybrids are sterile, meaning they cannot reproduce themselves. They're incapable of doing that for a variety of different potential reasons. But they are viable, meaning they live, but they just can't reproduce. So they reach sexual maturity, but they can't do anything about it, essentially. And again, they are essentially a dead end, and that's going to be definitely a negative effect on fitness for individuals who made a mistake and mated with the wrong species. Therefore, those individuals are eliminated from the gene pool because they have zero fitness, and over time, what we expect is fewer hybrids will form as a result of this particular postzygotic isolating mechanism. So a good example of this are mules. The only way you get more mules is to keep mating horses and donkeys together. And typically this is the female is the horse and the male is the donkey because, as of course you know, there or may not know, there is a pretty good size difference between the two species, but they're closely related enough to where they can mate and produce a hybrid. But again, the hybrid is viable and lives just fine, but it cannot reproduce. It's not possible for it to reproduce. Now there are some cases where folks have produced a fertile mule. And those guys are worth, or gals are worth, a lot of money because they are extremely rare. Most of the time, the mule is not fertile, so it's viable but not fertile. And so, if you want to make more mules, you have to keep mating horses and donkeys together. My daughter Zoe, one part of her job when she was at UC Davis as an undergraduate, working in the animal science program. That was her major because, again, she was on track to be a veterinarian, which she now is a equine surgeon. What part of her job was working in the breeding barn. And so she actually got to, or had to, however you want to look at it, collect, they called it collection, of sperm samples from the donkeys. And I will just let your imagination go wherever it's going to go because you're probably correct in what that involved. And then once you have the sample, then you can inseminate the chosen female mare who's ready to reproduce, and you get a mule. that is born, and of course you're on baby watch the closer that you get, because that baby could be born anytime, and you need to make sure that everything goes okay, which it usually did just fine. Mules are something that would really not form in the wild, because it's very, very rare for those species to have an occasion to encounter each other. But they're desirable for people because they have essentially a lot of positive qualities of each of the species combined into one organism, right? So they kind of have the strength of a donkey and maybe more of the endurance of a horse. Also, having the female be the horse, this means that mules basically imprint on their mom, and they will follow mom, or they will follow a horse wherever the horse goes. So if you are hauling materials, for example, up in the mountains where there are no roads, and you're on a trail and you're on horseback, it's a lot more efficient to load those supplies onto a bunch of mules, and the mules are then led. It's called a mule train, and they're led by a single horse in the lead, and they will just follow that horse wherever they go. So a lot of folks, again, who are in this world of breeding mules absolutely love their animals and take very, very good care of them. But again, the only way to get more mules is to keep breeding horses and donkeys. And our last post-zygotic isolating mechanism is known as hybrid breakdown, which is an odd name. It doesn't really explain exactly what it is. So in hybrid breakdown, again, you've had either a prezygotic mechanism that was not in place or was overcome, and you've had a hybrid form. The hybrid is viable, it survives, and it is fertile, but, so there's a little caveat there, it survives, it can reproduce, but it has very low fitness. So essentially what's going on, one of two things. One, you have two separate species, and their hybrid is really kind of caught between two worlds. It doesn't really fit in either habitat, right? And so therefore it's basically has a phenotype that's not well suited to the environment that it finds itself in, and so therefore it just has very, very low fitness, right? It doesn't survive terribly long, or if it does reproduce, it doesn't have very many offspring, or so on. The other thing that may possibly be a function of hybrid breakdown is if the hybrid itself breeds with other hybrids, those offspring are not viable or are sterile. So you do have this kind of dead end, again, negative reinforcement on the original individuals that were two different species and made a mistake and mated with each other and produced the hybrid in the first place. But that feedback doesn't happen, negative feedback doesn't happen for an extra generation, right? Because the initial hybrid that forms does survive and can reproduce, but albeit it has very, very low fitness. Again, either because its offspring don't survive or are sterile, or it's just not very well suited to the environment that it finds itself in. And both of those things do tend to reinforce speciation, but it's not nearly as strong as reduced hybrid fertility or reduced hybrid viability, both of which sort of exert strong selective pressure on the corresponding species to avoid forming hybrids by, of course, having the individuals that make mistakes have zero fitness. So there's sort of an immediate feedback consequence of that particular event, mating event. So what I mean by reinforced speciation is essentially keep the species apart so that they are continuing down their respective evolutionary trajectories, and those gene pools aren't trying to mix again. With hybrid breakdown, you do get some of that reinforcement, but in some cases, you can actually have what's known as a hybrid zone that forms basically where hybrids continue to form. And we've seen this with, when we were talking before about reduced hybrid viability with the frog example. the two different species, they overlap with their geographic range. And so if hybrids form at a low rate, over time, you would expect hybrids in that situation, hybrids to form less and less often because there's a big negative consequence for individuals that make a mistake. With hybrid breakdown, the consequence is not as severe or immediate. And so you may have essentially a hybrid zone that forms and continues to be perpetuated in the future, meaning every year you have a certain number of hybrids that form. So for example, we have two different salamanders in California that can interbreed and form hybrids that do survive and are fertile but have very lousy fitness. And these are the California tiger salamander. So this is a unique salamander that you only find in California, and specifically mostly in the Northern California and the Bay Area are the remaining habitat patches for this particular salamander, and they are super cute. It's the one on the right with the spots. And then there's the barred salamander, which used to be known as the eastern tiger salamander. And it's, as the name implies, eastern tiger salamander. It is not from California. It's a non-native species that was introduced, I believe, accidentally. But it's closely related enough to the California tiger salamander where they will interbreed sometimes. And unfortunately, what happens again is we have hybrids that form, and the hybrids have very low fitness. And so what this has meant for the California tiger salamander is their populations are declining, they're shrinking. And so individuals that mate with the wrong species obviously have very, very low to no fitness. And so this has had some very negative consequences for this particular species. And there are folks that are part of their job is trying to round up the barred salamanders and send them back where they came from because they're not supposed to be here. And we would like them to stop messing with our California tiger salamander gene pool. Okay, so as we've been discussing in class up to this point, you have, for the new species to form, right, you need to have some sort of a mechanism or a barrier to gene flow between two or more, in some cases, populations, such that if they're not sharing genes anymore, right, they're going to start to diverge from one another, meaning they're going to become more different from one another genetically. And when they become more different genetically, they're going to become more different phenotypically, right? And so this is the idea that any changes that occur in our respective separate populations are not going to be shared with the other population, right? So any random genetic changes are going to build up over time as a result of genetic drift. Any mutations that pop up in one population are not going to be shared with the other population because they're no longer interbreeding with each other as a result of this barrier to gene flow. You also may have selection operating on the two populations differently, such that different phenotypes are favored in each different population. So the ideas are, of course, are that those two populations get more and more and more different from each other. And as they're becoming more different, you're acquiring all these changes, they're not being shared. From those changes, we're getting those reproductive isolating mechanisms. That's where most of them come from. Some of them are the result of or are tied to the reason for the gene flow disruption in the first place, such as we talked about habitat isolation, is usually the result of habitat differentiation. So two populations are using the habitat differently. Behavioral isolation is often the result of changes in sexual selection, which can result in subpopulations forming, and you essentially have two populations that are no longer mixing or interbreeding with each other as a result of changes in courtship behavior. So again, here it's just sort of a visual here of what this can look like. So here's my populations. In this case, we have 3 of them, these little blue blobs here. And the double-headed arrow indicates that you have individuals moving back and forth between those populations, right? So we have gene flow, we have emigration and immigration. And then at some point here is this little red line is indicating that a barrier to gene flow has popped up. And again, it could be, we've talked about these in class, it could be any one of a number of different kinds of situations or mechanisms that are disrupting the gene flow between some of our populations. So here on the bottom trajectory, right, we have the remaining two populations keep interbreeding with each other, and any changes are going to be shared between them. So they're essentially evolving along this particular pathway. So it's not to say that evolution is not happening, it certainly is. But any changes are isolated to these populations and are not being shared with this one over here, which has essentially gone its own direction, right? So again, any changes are building up over time, and it's going along a separate evolutionary pathway. And of course, we can see is really changed, so much so that it is now so genetically different from the other populations, such that if hybrids do form, it's unlikely that they're going to be viable and fertile, meaning they're reproductively isolated from each other, and ta-da, we have two separate species. So again, prezygotic mechanisms keep hybrids from forming in the first place. Postzygotic mechanisms essentially have a number of different outcomes, but usually that outcome is to reinforce speciation. So essentially help keep those species apart as they're evolving, and reduce gene flow if it does become reestablished, and keep those evolutionary trajectories separate, and you reinforce the fact that you have two separate species. So that's typically the outcome of both reduced hybrid viability as well as reduced hybrid fertility, is reinforcing speciation. What can also happen is that hybrids do continue to form, and you end up with a stable hybrid zone, right? Usually this is a low level of hybrid formation, and that's more common to be seen with hybrid breakdown, as we were talking about earlier, that these hybrids can continue to form because there's less of a negative consequence for the individuals that mate with the wrong species, because their offspring are viable and they are fertile even though they have really lousy fitness. So again, the individuals that make a mistake are not going to have great fitness, but it might be just enough to perpetuate the formation of hybrids into the future. So you may end up with one possible outcome is ending up with a stable hybrid zone from that. What can also happen is essentially if you have a failure of both your prezygotic and your postzygotic isolating mechanisms, or you have not evolved a postzygotic isolating mechanism yet, and you are relying entirely on a prezygotic mechanism, most likely because speciation has occurred relatively recently. So maybe you're here in your trajectory, somewhere in here. What can possibly happen is if your early days, right, those two populations are not super different from each other yet, and then you reestablish gene flow. So you basically remove that barrier and allow those populations to start interbreeding with each other again. Then you can have fusion. Essentially, two populations that were headed down separate trajectories are now merged back together, and you're dealing with one species again that is interbreeding populations, and they're not isolated from each other. So that's another possible outcome. It's rare, but sometimes it does happen. Okay, that's all that I've got from here. There's one more question coming up, and then you're done.